Gib, thanks for coming to visit us today to talk about your work with the UNT Health Science Center. I want to start off today by having you give us a quick review of your personal history in Tarrant County and how you got connected with the Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine.
Well, we'll have to go back to 1970 and how it all came about. But I had just got elected to the Texas legislature at that time, and they were having a political gathering down at the Old Worth Hotel, which is about where the Fort Worth Club is right now, I think, somewhere in that area. And that used to be where all the politicians hung out. And I had just got elected, and they had a reception for all the new members of the legislature and all the elected officials. And it was Chamber of Commerce, I think, had put it on. And I made a mistake of getting cornered by Dr. Byers and Louisville and 2 or 3 other osteopathic hospitals. And mind you, at the time, I couldn't tell you the difference between a chiropractor and a osteopath. I mean, I was that far out of the medical arena. And after, I mean, they got a hold of them and started telling what they did and what their concerns was. And it was kind of, that's what the whole reception for, is meet people in different professions and whatever. And so they took advantage, and they knew I was naive and had no clue. And so they said, we have fresh meat here. And so, and after it got, they sold me on osteopathic medicine. And I mean, I told somebody after, I said, those guys ought to be in the used car business. I said, they can sell anything. and they did. And I think those guys, and there's several others just like, you know, Louisville and Byers and those fellows, and they took it to heart. They had a goal in mind, and they was going to build a hospital. And they had already kind of semi-started it, but they had to get all the nuts and bolts together before they could actually do it. And I have never seen anybody work as hard as those guys did on trying to put this thing together. And of course, at that time, you know, the hospital got no funding at all. It wasn't even hardly created at that time, I don't think. I never forget the first bill we passed that helped and it was because of them talking to me and talking to a fellow named Cordell Hull, who was also a state representative. And we passed a bill just give funding, not for the school, but for the profession itself. And where it would be just a little bit of stipend that would go into the cost of putting a hospital together. And so anyway, that's where my beginning with them was, and the relationship that we had was great. I mean, the guy named Ray Stoker that they hired to do some work with them, and he did a wonderful job himself. And I tell you what, after I started comparing apples and oranges, and you know, I said, I don't think I'd ever go to an allopath again. This is where I'm going to go, because I like their concept and I like what they're doing. And it was because just, you know, those guys were open about everything. And so that's my first introductory to them. And of course, it never faded after that.
So you started off working with the trio of founders on the Osteopathic Medical Center of Texas.
Right.
Is the hospital.
Right.
Then you transitioned into working with Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine, right, to get it situated in this location, I think, and to start getting it attached to the UNT system.
Well, at that time, there wasn't very much here to
Right.
attach to. I mean, I think they had a kind of a 2-story house over in the corner or whatever.
It's still there.
And so, but I think it's something to program. And those guys, I mean, of course, they got the Texas Medical Association, they got 50 lobbyists. I mean, they got a huge building, practice right across the street from where I have an office there in Austin now. But these guys just outworked them. I mean, that showed me what you can do if you're determined and got the goal in mind and you got the right stuff to sell. And they did. You
came to Fort Worth, you were in the Air Force, and you eventually became a state legislator. What motivated you to go into public service to begin with?
Well, one of the best movies I made was probably coming to Fort Worth.
Right.
And after I got out of the service, I went to work for a company named Olmsted Kirk Paper Company, and they were a wholesale paper firm that sold to people in the publishing business and the printing business and whatever it might be.
Right.
And the fellow who owned it, their headquarters was in Dallas, named Bob Armstead. And he wanted all his outside salespeople to be members of civic clubs. Oh. And that was his big deal. I was a member of the Kiwanis clubs. In fact, I served as president of the Fort Worth JCs, and we'd have 500 or 600 members at a meeting every Wednesday. And I was president of the JCs. Got in the Lions Club. I was president of the Lions Club, and first thing I know, I was president of most of those clubs. And came election cycle, and I had two members of the legislature at that time who knew me, and I knew them, and they asked me, said, you ought to think about running for the legislature. And I said, I never had thought about that. I don't know. I've got too much other things. I just started my own business about a year before that also. And I said, I don't think I ought to do that. And he said, well, listen, I said, I don't have time. He said, well, you got more time if you just regulate your time like you should. So a good example said, like we do, they had an office supply store, what they had together. And they said, we go in, we see our employees early in the morning, then we drive like heck. Said, they don't give you a ticket if you got SO plates on. And he said, you get in there and you could they can run a session and you can be there in time. Then next day, they're Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And on Thursdays, he said, we come in real early where you can get out and you can get back to your office by Thursday afternoon. And I said, well, that doesn't sound. So you're in your office all day Friday. And he said, plus you make $300 a month. And I said, well, I was paying myself $1,000 a month. And at that time, I said, that's a $300 raise.
Good.
And at those days, we ran countywide. Now they have single member district.
Right.
We ran countywide.
Oh.
And but it was not a blood sport like it is now. Because at that time,
Sure.
you file for a place on the ballot. You go 1, 2, 3. Mine was place 4. Then all the campaigning was done at civic clubs or gatherings, somebody's luncheon, and you get up and you tell me your qualification. And the fellow I was running against was incumbent, and he and I became the best of friends. And of course we didn't get after each other. I said, well, here's what I have done. Here's what, and he was a lawyer, and a great guy. In fact, we became very close friends, and I defeated him, and first thing I did when I got to Austin, I befriended the governor and got him appointed to a judgeship.
There you go.
About like we were talking about, lawyers want to be judges.
Right.
He thought that was a good deal, and I could always depend on him for a campaign donation.
So you served as a state representative for this area for many years.
Mm-hmm.
During that time, you were working with some individuals at it was still called Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine on various
TCOM,
projects.
we call it, yeah.
TCOM grew into the current UNT Health Science Center. Tell us just a little bit about some of the individuals you worked for and, their work style, their traits they had that you admired, that wanted you to keep your relationship going with our school.
Well, they did the people that was involved in putting this thing together were dedicated, as I said earlier.
Right.
And I became part of the family. And all the legislators now,
Great.
they would have dinners and stuff like that, and private dinners or whatever it might be, and to let people know what was going on. And it kept us informed at all times, every step it made. And of course, the longer I stayed, the better I got in position to help them more. And of course, when I became speaker, well, that's what turned the spigot on. And of course, the speaker can get anything he wants. So
I heard they used to call this the speaker's school.
Yeah, that's what
true?
they did. They did call it. They did. And the best move they ever made, they hired a fellow by the name of Danny Jensen. And Jensen was, he was just, he'd get hung on something. He stayed on it. He's like one of those little bear cats. and everybody loved him. And he worked all day long. He was going out to Capitol, and he would be in 20, 30 offices before the day was over, selling the school and what they were doing. And of course, me being a speaker, of course, I could pretty much direct where a lot of the funds were going at that time. And in fact, when we built this library, this was the only state money spent that year.
Yes.
And
So we are sitting in the Gibson D. Lewis Health Science Library. We're very appreciative of the effort you put forth to help us get funding for that.
Well,
I know that must have required some heavy lifting, but thank you. I don't know if you have any more information about that process.
Well, it was like I said, the only state money spent that year, and we put it here.
That was tough fiscal times for the state.
My chairman, of course, the speaker appoints all the chairmen and all the members of the committee. Well, he and I had a lot of real interesting conversations about why can't we give this a little bit over here, and we'll make it up next year. I said, no, we're going to do it this way.
Well, it worked out.
It worked out just fine.
Talk a little bit more about some of the individuals you worked with at TCOM and the UNT Health Science Center, and some of the projects that you were involved in over the years.
Well, let me assure you, there was a project every year. There was a need for money every year, and that was why it was important that you had that they had hired Danny Jensen, because he knew the process. And like I said, every morning when I came in my office, he was sitting there. He was waiting on me, and the first thing he'd ask is, "What have you done for me today? What have you done for me in the school today?" What have you done for me in the school today? That's what I want to know. In a very sincere way, he would do it, And then he would go out and he would start knocking over doors, because we always had a project. We always had something we had. We always had to see what we needed funds for this and that. So he never got a day off. And by doing that, and what they did, and what we was able to do, is to let people know what osteopathic medicine was all about. And the way we did it was just through basic, simple, hard work education. And a lot of people never realize how many osteopathics are in rural areas.
Sure.
Well, if you look at Texas got a lot of rural areas. And when I passed the bill to create the school, well, that's to make it a state-supported school. Well, that's how when I was on the mic. In fact, I got it recorded of somewhere and talked about it. I said, every one of you from a rural school, from a rural community, or you have rural cities. Right. I said, you allopathic doctors. I said, they're all nice people, but they don't go there. Right. They want to be a heart surgeon, or they want to specialize in something. These people out here, they specialize in whole bodies and getting people well. And I said, that's who you're going to be supporting, and that's what you're going to do. You're creating people that's going and go out and take care of your constituents, not somebody else. And that was my sell point from day one, and they bought it. And that's exactly what they were doing. That's what the hospitality profession does. They go to the rural area, go in full body health, and once you was able to explain it, it's easy to sell.
Interesting. We're talking, that's about 40 years ago, probably, roughly. That urban-rural divide for school issues is still a motivating factor in a lot of coalitions down in the legislature.
Oh, yeah.
It's interesting that that's sustained for 40 years, that kind of discussion.
Well, you have to do it because, you got a fellow who's running for re-election, whether it's in the House or the Senate. Well, he's going to each and one of the people he's got to know is all the mayor and the councilpeople, the people there. So he knows he's got a responsibility to make sure that when he goes home and the mayor asks him, "What have you done for me today or this week?" they can say, "Well, here's what I've done for you."
Okay, looking at the Gibson D. Lewis Library in our Health Science Center campus today, how do you feel about the growth and the legacy of this institution, your contribution to that?
Well, I consider, knowing all the people who really put the work into it, my contribution was very small, even though it might have been large to some extent.
Right.
There's steps that had to be taken and made. But I think, I admire the people who built this place and who've been here for the last 30, 40 years, however long, about 50 years now. And I admire what they've done and make the contribution at all of them. And they've done it, unselfishly. They've done it because it's in their heart to do it. And I think that's what, it made it what it is. And of course, too, Fort Worth need a medical school, and that's what we always said. That's what we do. And we did have to step over some people to get here. I'll tell you that. Because if you think this was easy, you never saw the opposition, because the opposition was out there and strong. Because I never will forget, I had the bill was on committee. It was in the education committee, and I said, I'd already talked to all the members. I said, now, are you going to vote for my bill? And they said, yeah, we'll do it. Well, I got a call from a staff person, and they said, the chairman had decided he'd had a few visits from some of his constituents who were all Alabama, and he said, he's not going to hear that bill tonight. And I said, oh, really? So I got on and I called him, and I said, Becky said that you were not going to let that bill out tonight. Well, I've got problems with that, and a lot of my constituents got problems with that, and he kind of crawfishing around with it. So I had to make a little threat to him. If that bill didn't come out of committee that night, because I told him, I said, I've got all the votes. I said, they all want to vote for it. I said, if it doesn't come out, I said, you're going to be amazed how much press we're going to get tomorrow when you and I cross each other on the House floor. I said, because nobody's ever knocked the hell out of you, but I'm fixing to. So, well, sure enough, it came out of committee that night.
Yeah.
I know Jay Beckworth thinks that's a funny story because he was part of it. I don't know if you know Jay Beckworth. He's a local doctor here. Right. And he thinks that's his favorite story.
I know there's to this day probably some, back and forth between the allopathic, osteopathic communities. You did a lot to help break that down, get the school authorized. Did you ever feel there was a point during that process when you thought, we've won, we've got acceptance from MDs, which is a little different than, getting the bill passed? I think you were instrumental in maybe helping the osteopathic profession progress to that level of acceptance.
That was always the most frustrating thing, really. It was acceptability to get the osteopathic profession brought up to where it was acceptable by everybody. And it always bothered me, about trying to get our students in these internship programs. And that was the big issue I took on, was doing that and trying to get some of these hospitals to open up. And John Peter Smith is a good example. It took some doing to get them to find out. But once they did it, they were tickled to death. I guarantee you go over right now, they'd rather have a DO than an MD any day of the week over there. And and that's what I always say, just get that acceptability. And once we got it, you don't have to worry about it anymore.
Let me come back to the library building specifically. I think I've mentioned this to you before, but it was very clear when this building, you helped get the funding, get it authorized. This building was a statement to the medical community at large, not just Fort Worth or Texas, even the medical community in the United States, that this school had a grand vision. They were going to become more than DCOM. They were going to grow into a full spectrum health science center, that osteopathic physicians could do that. And I think you had a big role of, clearly, as I already mentioned, the building being built. This building was a symbol, specifically mentioned as a symbol by our school's administration back then, that this school was big. It had big ideas and big motivation. So I think you played a huge role in that process.
If I recall, I think this was phase 3 in our program.
Yes, this was building 3.
Yeah, and one thing, at the same time, I served on the board of the hospital here. They were so kind to appoint me to the board, and of course I learned a great deal because you had all those docs on the board. I think there was 20 on the board. I think 10 were docs and 10 were lay people, and you get a pretty good education there.
Yep.
And what happens too, you become knowledgeable about what the real needs are. And once you got that, then you have a vision that what can happen and what you got to do to get there.
Yeah. So I think you deserve maximum credit for helping them make their vision into a reality and making the school what it is now.
You
were there to help give them the resources they needed.
Well, I'll be honest about it. very, very honored when they chose to name it
great.
after me.
Awesome.
That's probably one of the nicest honors I've ever had, is to have this library named after me. One I take a great deal of pride in.
Awesome.
And that's why, as we went along in my latter years as speaker, when Danny would come to me and say, "What have you done for me in the school day?" I said, "I just gave you a library while I was
It's a great gift. You know, we're talking about Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine, UNTHSC Science Center, a very particular kind of education. But general education, K through 12, college education is important to our school. I'm sure you heard from Danny Jensen a lot about support for education at all levels. I know one of the things that our school was interested in and cared about was that Education Reform Act, I think 1984, and you had a role in that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I had a matter of fact, a very big role in that. It came accidentally. It came by accidentally, and I was noticing in my own company, I was hiring people, and I was getting young people out of school, and I'd hired about 3 young ladies to work in the front office, just kind of answer the telephone, and that when you walked in, they said, "Can I help you?" and do whatever, and do the typing and whatever. And all of a sudden, I couldn't find anybody that could spell a word, that really could just carry on a conversation with somebody on the phone. And I started saying, I said, "What in the world's going on here?" And I started talking to other business people. They were having the same problem. And I got elected speaker, and I that was in the back of my mind. And I had Mark White, who was a good friend of mine, and he was elected governor at the same time.
Right.
And he had came over to my office, and he said, "Well, here's what I want. And I want to put emphasis on my year as governor." And I said, "Well, I'll tell you what I want." I said, "I want a better education system than we got." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, and I told him, I said, "I've hired people." And I said, they just not qualified because they're illiterate to some extent. And so he said, "Well," he said, "I want to make sure we get an increase in salary for the school teachers." I said, "I'm all for that too. But at the same time, I want something for my money. I want a better educated student coming out of that." And so we sat down and we got the lieutenant governor, and we, the 3 of us came together and decided what we would do is get a committee. And we appointed what we thought was the key people that we knew in education or in business or whatever. And we created this committee of no legislators, nobody elected officials in it. And Vice Provost, we asked him to be the chairman. And so he took over the chairman. And I've always wondered, many people want to know why some people are rich. After watching him work, I knew why he was rich. Because I've never seen anybody that had much go and fire and determination as he did. And they did a great job. And they brought it back to us and their recommendations, and we put them in a bill, and we passed that bill. Because we made a lot of bad people mad, because anytime you change up the system, you got people that's against it. But we changed it, and we did it, and it was accepted nationwide as the big step in improving quality education.
That has to rank as one of your best contributions to this school.
Every
one of our students, well, at least 90%-ish of our students come through Texas school systems. So having them better educated helped this institution immensely progress with their education.
I felt like it did.
Thank you.
And that was, I think, one of the, if I have a star in my crown, that would be it.
Awesome. I'm glad we had a chance to talk about that a little bit. That certainly impacted the future of the school. One of the final things I wanted to just discuss or mention was just the growth of this library we're in, the Gibson D Lewis Library building. It's changed a lot over the almost 40 years of its existence. It's morphed from a very traditional library, quiet, books on shelves, into much more of a student center. this building, your building, is very important to the daily life of all of our students. And I just wanted to get your reaction to that ability of the building to adapt and grow. You know, we have now going in on our first floor a medical simulation center with amazing technology. All that contained in that one building that so long ago you worked to help get funding for. That's a great accomplishment that we're very grateful for you for doing that.
You all will be amazed what that's going to do to the quality of these doctors when they
Right.
get out of here. Because
The simulation.
that simulation, I mean, you're not reading it in a book and thinking you understand what the book says. You're looking at it, you got a hands-on. And I think I was, my favorite jokes years ago were Dr. Byers and Dr. Luba. And I said, now you guys, how y'all going to, put somebody on the table? You going to be on the table one day and you're going to be giving instructions, and Luba, you're going to go on the next day? And you got, where you can have a hands-on experience, the student can have a hands-on.
Right.
And so that was always a funny joke with those guys. I thought it was funny.
Well, now we'll have patients that are virtual who never get tired,
Yeah.
who never complain.
Well, I've seen those, and I'll tell you what, that's going to move. That's going to move medical care forward. I think 50 years,
Right.
and I mean, because it's going to make that education hands-on. When they see what it is, they're not guessing. I mean, they see, those dummies or whatever they got.
Right.
I mean, you get to really put your hand on and work on them, and don't have to worry about them getting off the table.
Sure. And little did you know 40, 45 years ago when you were working with our people on this building's funding that was going to be taking place. That's like future stuff from the Jetsons.
Oh yeah.
And it's coming true starting in a couple months.
Yeah.
So super exciting. I mean, we're hugely in your debt for all that work you did long ago. It's given us, the building's given us great service for so many decades, and it's only getting better.
You're giving me way more credit than I deserve, but I tell you, the credit belongs, but I'm on every president that y'all had here. And the quality of people y'all had over the years, and the people that had the desire and the love to do what they're doing, that's who gets the credit, not me. I just happen to be at the right place at the right time to try for the funding.
I still think you deserve maximum credit, equal credit to the founders of the school. You made a lot of dreams come true over the past several decades here, and we're all in your debt, and we greatly appreciate that.